Okay, so in the last video, we saw how to access SQL Server Databases from Java from first principles. Okay, so we took charge of loading the jar file. We had a quick look at that load jar file library method, which is just down here. There it is. Okay, and then we created a user in our SQL Server database, and we set them up with a login to the DB patients table. I only gave them access to the DB patients database, and we set up a patient login with a password, a crappy password, and I showed you how you could restrict that login to just access that DB patients database. Know what the database is in your database, in your SQL Server, and then we ran a query to get the number of. Well, we could run a query to get anything, and we filled in the code for the get string value from a database method. Okay, so that's what we got to last time. So we did quite a bit. This time we're going to have a look at, because this is so useful, we're going to look at how to get a number of rows in the result set. Okay, and we've sort of written the code a little bit here. Okay, so this code here counts the number of rows. Okay, so we start with a result set and we keep going next and adding one to a counter until next is no longer true. There's no longer any more data to look at. Okay, so this is basically the code here. It's just got to put the try catch around it and that sort of thing, and declare a variable and return a variable. Okay, but that's the basic code here. And so we just have a look at moving this code down into this method here because it's such a useful thing to do. Okay, and there are different ways to do it depending on the version of SQL Server you're connecting to, or depending on the database you're connecting to. Is it MySQL? Is it MongoDB? Whatever it is, there's different ways to count the number of rows in a result set. Okay, and for some databases you can create a cursor in a database, and you can count the number of rows and then step back, move the cursor back to the start, and then read through the data to get the actual data back. And we might even have a look at some of that now to have a bit of a play with that. Okay, so we're looking at doing the get number of rows in a result set method. Okay, now we could do it this way, where while result set.next is equal to true and add one to a counter. The problem with that is it leaves the result set pointing to the end of the data. After you've set through the data, that leaves it pointing to the end. There are commands you can run to move it back to the start. For example, you can say result set.first or result set.before first, and so on. But we'll just do it even shorter way. So we're not looping through all the rows. We're just jumping right to the end and counting what that position is. Okay, so it's a little bit faster than counting and looping through all the rows. Okay, so we need to say result set dot last, and probably we should see if result set's null before we do this anyway. So if result set is not equal to null, then we want to say result set dot last. So we're moving to the very last record in the result set, and we're getting the row number for that record. So number of rows equals result set dot get row. Okay, so that gives us the row number of that last row. So we've jumped straight to the end. We haven't looped through all the rows. We just jumped straight to the end, and now we've got the number of rows. It's the number of that row. Get row gets the number of that row. For example, 457. And then we've got to restore the result set back to the original value, or move the cursor back to the original location, and we say dot before first. Okay, so that command there moves to the last row in the query set in the data set. That gets the row number of the last row, and this one here moves the cursor back to the start, or moves the pointer back to the start. Move back to the start of the data. So that if anything else uses a result set, we haven't polluted it or destroyed it by leaving it pointing to the last record. Okay, so that's very important that you do that. Okay, now we're almost done. Again, these commands here can raise exceptions. So you've got to put this code here, or certainly this code here, inside a try catch. So we might as well put all of that inside a try catch. It doesn't hurt to put it all in there. So try, and just tab, and then catch. And again, we'll just catch exception. We could catch different flavors of exception and do different handling, but we'll just catch exception as a whole, We're not worried about the different flavors, whether there's a database error or whatever error. And here we just want to set the number of rows to 0. So if there's any sort of error that occurs up here, we'll just set number of rows to 0 and return 0. Okay, and that does exclude the column headings. Okay, so now we can use this method to get the number of rows in the result set. So we could actually take this code out now and use and just call getNumberOfRowsInResultSet result set and pass in the result set object. Okay, so we could take that out if we wanted to. We might leave this code as it is in for now, because we're also getting data back from the database in this loop. So we're not just counting rows inside this loop, we're also getting the actual data back. In other words, the results of our query, okay, formatted as a string. Okay, so we might leave that code there for now, and what we'll do is we'll use our new method, our getNumberOfRowsInResultSet, and we'll definitely use this method in what we're going to do now, which is our get the array of data, the 2D array of data from the database. Okay, so yep, so let's move on and we'll do that now. Okay, so we know earlier method we got one piece of data from the database. Here we want to get a 2D array of data, a table of data from the database. Okay, so the code here is actually very similar to what we did earlier. It's just extending it so that it's getting the array of data, not just a single piece of data. Okay, so what we might do to start with is we might go and grab our earlier code. So this is the code from our getString from database, and we'll copy and paste this code and adapt it. Okay, so I'll grab everything from the try onwards. So we're in getString from string value from database, and I'll grab everything from the try onwards down to and including the catch. Okay, and I'll go Control-C to copy it, and then I'll scroll down into our getObjectArray2D from database method, and I'll replace those to-dos comments or placeholders, or replace it with the code we just copied. So I'll paste it in there, Control-V. Okay, so that's what we've got so far. So we've got some code in our getObjectArray2D from database at the moment, but this only works for a single data item. We want to make this so it works for the array of data or a table of data. And there's a few things we need to change here. Because we're going to use our new getNumberOfRowsInResultSet method, we need to also change how we create the connection to the database and what the parameters are for the connection to the database. And we do that via the statement object. Okay, and in here we say ResultSet dot type scroll insensitive. And we also want to provide another parameter, just so we can speed things up a little bit. We'll ResultSet dot concur read only. Okay. In other words, we're not doing updates; we're just doing reads. Okay. So we're providing a few extra parameters to our create statement method, so that we can get a bit more power over what we can do. And if you want to find out what these constants are, there's a whole heap of them in Java. I'll go into the help here and I'll look at ResultSet, and you'll see here that there's a whole heap of these constants. So concur read only, the type scrolls case insensitive, and remember we did the first and last. So there's closing a connection, there's going back to the first record, there's going back to before first, there's going back to there should be a last down here. Yep, IJKL. There's the last. Okay, so and you can also do is first, is last, is close. There's hundreds of methods, and as you can see, our scroll bar's barely moved. So there's millions of records or millions of methods in here you can call for result sets. Very, very powerful stuff. We're just going to stick with the basics. Okay, but it's all there in the Java help if you want to look it up further. Okay, so we've changed the way the parameters for our database connection by providing two extra parameters, type scroll case insensitive or type scroll insensitive and concur read only. And that's so we can jump forwards and backwards through the data. We can jump to the end and then jump back to the start again and all that sort of thing. So we're just having a bit more control over what we're doing with our data. We're not just moving forward through the data. We can now jump around if we need to, which is really what we need to do when we're doing this get number of rows, because we're going to the last row and then jumping back to the first row. Okay, so we need to be able to jump around. So these parameters are required when you do that sort of thing. Okay, what we might do is, well, we can do it. There's a whole lot of ways we can do it. And what we might do is number of rows, yep, equals, and we'll just call our getNumberOfRows method. And that requires a result set object. So that's our result set object. Okay, and that's get the number of rows in, or rows of data, and that's excluding column headings. Just keep that in mind. So if we're creating an array to store all the data, and we want to also store the column headings, we need to make it one bigger than the number of rows to store the number of headings, to store the required headings as well. Okay, and then if number of rows is equal to 0, then there's really no point going ahead because there's no data. So we could say just return null. The array's empty, there's no data. Okay, now, is that really what you want to do? Okay, maybe what you want to do, because what if there's no data but there's still the column headings and you want to show the column headings with nothing under them? Then what we want to probably do is, there's many ways you can do it. I'll just go for the simplest way and I'll add one there, and that's, or take account of column headings. Okay, so now if the number of rows is 0, then we return null. So now, if we haven't got anything, not even the column headings, we're just going to return null. So it's going to be a null in the object array 2D gets returned. Okay. Then we can look at our number of columns, and we'll do the same thing. If number of columns is 0, then we can return null. There's no columns. Okay. Not even headings. Okay. Okay, now that we're here, we know how big to create the array. Okay, we know how many columns we've got, and we know how many rows we've got, including the headings, so we now can create the array. So that's our array there, and we're going to create an array of objects. So that array is equal to new object. So we're creating an array of objects because we don't know what the data is coming in from the database. It could be, we don't know which columns are strings, which are dates, which are integers, which are floats, which are booleans, which are whatever, okay, which are images. So we're just going to create an array of object, and then we can use our various classes in Java to deal with that data. Okay, we can interrogate it later on, but we'll just store everything as object for now. But behind the scenes, Java knows what the data is for each particular row and column intersection. Okay, so we're creating a number of objects, and we want so many rows, so it's number of rows, and then we want the number of columns. So we're creating a 2D array of data based on the number of rows and columns that are returned from our database, including the headings. Okay, so now we've got our array created, and it can store any type of data that can be stored in Java. It's an array of object, which means any sort of data at all for each cell of the array. We can now put some data in that array. Okay, so I might just put a comment in for a start, and then we're declaring the array. And it's a 2D array to hold all of the data plus the column headings. Okay, so I've got the array now, and what we're going to do is loop through that many rows and put the columns in, the column headings in, and then we want to loop through, so we want to loop through all the columns and add the column headings into the array, and then we want to loop through all the rows and put all the row data into the array. So you've got to do 2 loops here, because it's 2 separate bits of data. One's the column headings and one's the data. And they come across as different ways from SQL Server. Okay, let's do the rows first. So let's get the column headings into the array, 2D array. Okay, so we want to have a row counter, int row is equal to 0. Whoops, and I'll end that for int c is equal to 0. So c is the column number. C equals 1. I'll explain why the 1 in a second. And C is less than number of columns. And C++. Okay. And then we want to store the data in the array. So it's object array row. We declared it with rows and columns, so we've got to access it that way as well. So row and then column. And we want to get the column heading now. Okay. Now I've played around with this sort of thing a lot, and I've found issues if you're not careful. So this is a safe way I've found to do it. Okay. So it's a little bit long-winded, but I'm sure you can shorten this down. It's just the way I found it works. Always bulletproof. So new string. So we're creating a string for each heading's a string. String.format. String.format. .format. %s. Oh dear. %s. And then we want to get the column name from our metadata. Okay, so that's this metadata chap here. The metadata contains the column headings, and the result set contains the row data. Okay, so it's metadata dot get column name, square brackets, round brackets C, and then what I generally do. So that brings all the data across. Okay, so string.format %s, and we create a new string based on that, and then I trim it to remove white space from either end, and that should be pretty close. Or is that part of the? Yep. And then close round bracket, and then semicolon. So we're just closing a round bracket from that. Okay. Now, one thing we've got to change here. So all the data coming across from SQL Server, 1 is the first element in the array, but in Java generally 0 is the first element. So we want to say C-1 here. So we're starting at 1, but C-1 or 0 is the first column for our array. Okay, but in SQL Server, 1 is the first column. Okay, so we're just doing C-1, so we make sure we get the data aligned correctly and all the data that we need. Okay, it's converting between SQL Server arrays and Java arrays, so we're just doing things the right way. Okay, so that gives us the data, the column headings into the array, into the first row of the array, or row 0. Okay, now we want to get the actual data. Into the 2D. Okay, so, and again, it's similar code to what we had here with looping through the results set. Okay. Okay, and we don't want to do the number of rows anymore. We've already worked that out. Okay, and so what we want to do is say, so we want to put a loop like this down here as well, or at least the top of it. Okay, so while the results set next is equal to true, then we're going to loop through all of the arrays, all of the rows that come in from the result set, and we're going to add 1 onto the row. That's this row here, so row ++. Okay, and over here we're going to say get object C. Okay, I'm going to store that. Okay, so we're storing the data in the object array. One thing we want to do up here as well is add 1 onto row. Okay, so row ++, because we've now moved on past the headings. We now want to add data. Okay, so that's why I'm adding 1 onto row here. That's our row there. Okay, so row, column -1, so we can convert from Java arrays, from SQL Server arrays which start at index 1, to Java arrays which start at index 0. Unless you want to start them at 1, of course, you can if you want. Just waste a little bit of space. And so we're saying results set. We don't want to put this. We don't want to convert it to a string anymore, because we want to preserve dates as dates. If you want to bring everything across as strings, we leave this code here as it is, but we want to preserve the data type. So a date comes across as a date, a float comes across as a float. Okay, so we don't want to convert to strings there anymore. So we just want to say ResultSet.getObject C. C equals 1, C is less than or equal to number of columns. It's equal to because arrays start at 1 and go up to and include number of columns. Same here, less than or equal to. Lucky I caught that, that would have been a mistake. Okay, less than equal to number of columns. Less than equal to number of columns, that's right. C equals 1. Just having a quick check over my code, C++, C++. Here we're using a string format with a %s to convert whatever the data is that comes across in the heading block. We're converting it to a string, no matter what. Down here we're not doing a new string or a string.format because we want to keep the actual native type of the data. Is it Boolean? Is it string? Is it double? Is it an image? Whatever it is. Okay. And row and C-1, and then row ++ to add 1 for the next row. And we keep leaving while result set .next is equal to true, which is right. So we can take out that now. And then statement.close, connection.close. So it's got to be in that order. You've got to close the statement first and then the connection. And that's that. So it looks pretty good to me. Let me just have a quick final check over. We're declaring an object, an array of objects, a 2D array of objects, and setting it to null, set the number of rows to 0, create the connection, create the statement with the parameters so that we can move backwards and forwards through the data, run the query, and then we can see what we got back. Get the number of rows, call our getNumberOfRows method, and if number of rows is 0, return null. Get the number of columns using the metadata. If number of columns is 0, return null. Nothing's in the array, no need to process it further. Otherwise, declare the array. Move the column headings in as the first row. So row 0 is the first row, and then add 1 onto row. So we're then pointing at row 1, and then add the row data in for each column. That's all looking pretty good to me. And then close and close, and that should be right. Now we should be done. Okay. So the query I'm running here is I'm selecting the patient ID, the first name, plus a space, plus a last name as patient name, and also their suburb from patient. So I'm going to get the ID and the name and the suburb for all patients. And I'm putting rtrim in there because if there's lots of spaces after the data, if they're not a variable length char field, if they're a fixed length char field, all this data will come across with lots of spaces after it. So rtrim just trims off the extra data. Okay, before it sends it down to us, so it saves bandwidth as well. Okay, so things will be a bit faster. So that's getting our array of objects, and I'm doing 2 loops here. As long as the array is not null, I'm leaping through all of the rows in the array, which is r2d.length. That's the number of rows, and then r2d for that row.length gives us a number of columns for that row. Okay, and I'm just printing out the data for each row and column, trimming it, and then adding a tab after it. Okay, so I'm just displaying it out to the screen, tab separated, and at the end of every row of data, I'm outputting a new line. So every row starts on a new line. Let's run that and see what it looks like. Oh, got some errors there. Objects, object, not objects. 2 errors. Get column name, metadata.get column name. Okay, so I can see there's an extra bracket here that's gone wrong. Okay, so let's just go up and have a look at that. So it's line number 216, metadata.get column name. New string format S. So we're going to open round bracket, close round bracket for that. Oh, column. There's a missing N. Column name. There we go. Missing N there. And one more error. Data string. So it's not data string anymore. It's all we're going to do is print out an error. And then just for completeness, we'll print out a stack trace as well. That's good, all good. Okay, because data string no longer exists down here. That was just something we're using up in the get string from database method. Okay, so that should work. So we'll run our query and see the results on screen. And there it is. So we're getting the IDs, the patient names, and the suburbs. And if they had a whole lot of spaces in here, if it was a fixed length char field, we're trimming off the spaces and adding a space there between the names, and everything's nice and neat. Okay, so that's getting a string from a database and also getting a 2D array of data from a database. Okay, and you might be asking yourself there, well, aren't there easier ways? Surely in this modern age, you don't need to write all this code to get data from a database, and that's entirely true. Okay, there are add-ons you can use for Java and libraries included with Java that are called ORMs, Object Relationship Managers, and they can help you get data from a database and just send it straight to a GUI component, and you don't have to write a lot of this code. The good thing about writing this code is you understand what's happening, and also you've got full control over what's happening. Okay, so there's an issue, you're not relying on something that's gone wrong inside the ORM or some special case where there's a null or something tripping things up. You can put your debug statements in here and see what's going on. And also the other beauty of doing it this way is you only need to write the code once. So you only have to write this get object array 2D from database once, and you'll store it in a SQL database.java file, and you'll just call it whenever you need it. And same with the get number of rows and get the string from a database and load jar file. You put all those in their own SQL database.java file, and you'll just include that in all your projects whenever you need, and you'll never have to write the code again. Okay, and it'll be the same little bit of code being used in multiple projects. So you might think it's a lot of code at the start, and it seems pretty complex. It's not really, and the good thing is you only have to write it once, like I say. And now you've got full control over what's going on in the database. Okay, so let's do a quick final review, and we'll just go through all of the code that we've written. Okay, so we've got our database URL. I'm connecting to a local database host, my local install of SQL Server. I've got a database in there called DB Patients, as I showed you in the prior video, and I set up a patient login and a password for a user, and gave them only access to DB Patients, so they don't have access to the other databases in my SQL Server install. Okay, so this application, if someone reverse engineers it and finds a password, then they still can't get access to the other database tables or the other databases. They can only access that one database. Okay, there's the load jar file library, which is the way you can load the SQL Server jar file. And so it's that chap there we're loading in. Okay, and this jar file is something that Microsoft provides, and it lets you work with SQL Server databases. Okay, so that's very nice of them to do that. And I've found that one version of the jar file works for everything from SQL Server 2008 onwards up to SQL Server 2020. The same jar file works. So you don't need to keep changing stuff. And then we saw the code in there for that, for loading the jar file and getting it ready so we can use the commands that are in the jar file. And then we've got a method getString from a database, which creates a connection, creates a statement based on that connection, creates a result set based on that statement, and runs the SQL query, whatever query is passed in. And then looks at the number of columns in the result set and gets the data back. So we're just expecting one value here, so the number of rows should be 1, and we're getting one bit of data back from the database because we're just running a query to get a string from a database. Okay, and then if the number of columns is 1, if the number of columns is not equal to 1, or the number of rows is not equal to 1, we're going to get an error coming out instead of the data. And then closing the connections and the statements, and that's it, returning the data. Okay, then we had to look at the next method, which was get the number of rows in the result set, and we saw that we could fast forward to the end of the data, get the row count of that data, and then jump back to the start. A result set.first or before first. Before first I tend to like better. Okay, before first. And put that in a try catch, and away you go. You can now get the number of results in a result set really easily. And we're going back to the before first, so that we can restore our result set back to the state it was in when we called this method. We're not leaving it dirty at the end of pointing at the end of the data there. Okay. And then the final method we worked on today was the getObjectArray2D from a database, which gets an array or a table of data from the database. And we saw we had to put these extra parameters in so that we could scroll backwards and forwards through the data. And the rest of this code was based very heavily on what we'd done earlier. We're creating the array when we know how big it is. If the number of rows is 0 or number of columns is 0, there's no point creating the array. We just return null. Okay. Otherwise, we create the array, and then we put the headings into the array as row 0, and then we put the data into the array from row 1 onwards. And that's what these commands here do. Okay. So for each result, for each row in the result set, we're looping through all the columns in the result in that row and putting the data into the correct cells of the array. Okay, and then closing the connections and statements and returning the array object. And then we saw that we could call these methods in our main. We can just say get string value from database and pass in a query, select count staff and patient, or select a patient from the database, or whatever you want to do. This is just selecting a count. We could do whatever we like, any query that returns a value. And here we're getting a table of data back with this other query. So we're calling our getObjectArray2D from database. And we could even make that a method a method that we can call again later as display the database to the console screen. And so for each row of our array and for each column for each row, we're displaying the value. It's separated by tabs or whatever you like, spaces or whatever you like. And after each row, we print a new line so that we've got each row starting on a new line. And so it's all quite nice and easy, really. And like I said, the beauty of it is, once you've written the code, you'll never have to write it again. And when you adapt this to work with MongoDB or MySQL or any other database or SQLite, all you have to do really is just adapt this SQL Server code. There's a few changes you need to make, but it's not a huge change at all, really. Certainly when you move from SQL Server to MySQL or SQLite, it's not a big change at all. Okay, you're basically loading a different jar file, and the parameters on some of the queries or some of the settings are slightly different. For example, these change here slightly depending on what database you're using. Okay, but I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to look in my GitHub. All the code's in my GitHub if you need it. Okay, thanks for watching. Have a nice day.